I still remember when I was in high school that I heard an awful lot of people say to Christians when they would evangelize to them or when they would bring a Christian point of view in opposition to whatever secular idea was being promoted, the following oppositional phrase: don't push your faith on me. Who are you to push your faith on me? And unfortunately, back then, one of the common responses, or the common response from Christians, is to shy away and cower and even tremble at the accusation. And therefore, that led them to be quiet and even try to justify why they were doing what they were doing, not in the sense to try to explain to them that they were doing something good and honorable and Christian, in that they were keeping the commands of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, to communicate the gospel, but rather for appeasement. And for appeasement, I mean trying to appease the supposed wrath of the sinners whom we're trying to tell Christians to stay quiet. Now, in the ensuing years, especially in the digital internet era, a lot of that has been dismissed because there have been very capable people, whether they be polemicists, Christians that are good, as it were, at witnessing, apologists, and others, whom have turned the tables on that very idea and have demonstrated it for the fallacy and the ridiculousness that essentially that phrase encapsulates and is. But there are those with very, very, very strong platforms in this day and age that are still using that very same phrase, in a sense, thinking that that is a legitimate form of argumentation against any displays, public displays, and communications of the gospel. So therefore, it behooves us once again to take up that topic and to demonstrate the not only absurdity of it, but how downright evil it actually is, and why Christians are downright idiotic to accept the premises of this criticism which seeks to silence the dissemination of the gospel. Welcome each and every one of you to this new episode, this new live stream of Irrespective. My name is Gio, for those of you that might be joining us for the first time. For those of you that have been watching these episodes for some time now and have not yet subscribed, I would encourage you to do so. At the beginning of these podcasts, live stream episodes, you very well know that I like to do the housekeeping items as quickly as possible so we get to the topic at hand. That's what I'm doing here. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, click that thumbs up button if you haven't done so yet, and share our content with others. If you have not yet subscribed and you enjoy what we're doing here, please subscribe. I also encourage you to interact with me in the chat, whether you're watching this on X, Rumble, or YouTube. Place your question or comments in that chat. We have access to those chats. We're watching the chats as we speak. Also, if you are highly elucidated, informed, if you are edified by what we offer here on Irrespective, we would encourage you to donate. It helps us to keep the lights on here and to continue to do what we're doing. There's a QR code that just appears on the screen. You can scan that. Conversely, there is a link in the description box that you can click or tap on depending on the device you're using to watch this transmission, to be taken to PayPal's website, which we use to process those donations. For those of you that have been donating, thank you so much for your patronage. For those of you that will donate, again, thank you for your consideration and your economic aid. Last but not least, don't forget to follow us on the socials. You can find us on X, Irrespective77 is the username on X, and you can also follow us on TikTok. Our username there is the Irrespective. All right. The reason for today's topic is because I saw a couple of clips from the now viral interview between Joe Rogan and Vice President J.D. Vance. Some of you might criticize me for saying, that's a few days old, where have you been? Well, I'm not one to follow, as it were, the way that other people do with respect to virality. That is something that has been a malady in American culture for some time now. It's not something that's just happened in the internet age. It's also happened in the past and has been a trend in our society with respect to the mainstream media age. Here's this topic. It's of absolute importance. You put on the 6 o'clock news, the network news, and they'll talk about that topic for 5 minutes or less. And now this, next topic. And now this, the next topic. And it moves from topic to topic to topic to topic. And in many instances, what ends up happening is that the absolute importance of one particular subject matter gets overlooked for the simple fact that, well, people are tired of paying attention to this, so let's show them this other shiny object, even though the necessity or the needful information that we need in order to have an informed opinion about that topic that we were just talked about can't be covered exhaustively, not even in 5 minutes, not even in half an hour, not even in 3 hours. But that is the age of show business, as it were, because let's face it, network news media is part of show business. That's all it is. It's to get you to tune in, to add up the viewer numbers, and then to sell commercial space. That's what it's all about. It's not really about informing. It's just about getting your attention. Anyways, that very same trend has continued to this point where when you look at your social media feed, I guess even that trend can even be considered as if it's on steroids. Because when you look at your timeline on social media, it's one thing after another, and you're not even paying attention necessarily to 20 seconds, for 20 seconds on that particular tweet or Facebook post and whatnot before you're bombarded with a series of other things that are trying to vie for your attention. Someone called the purveyors of this sort of a system attention merchants. I think it's a good phrase to describe that. So I don't subscribe to this whole thing of that's yesterday's news, let's move on to this shiny new thing. If that is worthy to be talked about because it allows us to have a better informed, more Christian thought process on the matter, then it requires us not to move on to the next thing, not to move on to the next shiny toy or whatever it is they're trying to get us to pay attention to, but to focus on that thing and talk about it substantively. Well, there are two portions that I'd like to highlight from the Joe Rogan interview with J.D. Vance, where they speak about religion in the public sphere. And Joe Rogan, for all of the Christians that have been saying that lately he's been becoming more sympathetic to Christianity, and that's to talk about one segment of the Christian population that listens to Rogan and wants to try to make him more than what he is. There's another group whom will not only extend that consideration to him, they just outright call him as being Christ adjacent. Not necessarily a Christian, but Christ adjacent. But then he says things like what he said to J.D. Vance and what he is affirming in this interview with the Vice President of the United States that tells me very clearly that this guy in reality is not a sincere Christian, as some would say that he is. And maybe that he's not even necessarily Christ adjacent, because when you hold views like what you're about to listen to what he holds, then you have to come to the conclusion that that's not the case. You can't extend that consideration to him. That's just one point. But remember, the main focus of our live stream on this evening is to talk about how there are those that still hold to this idea of when you preach the gospel, when a Christian communicates the gospel, that is necessarily pushing, they use that term, or enforcing religious dogma, doctrine, belief on another. We'll get into the particulars of why that is so patently absurd in just a few moments, but I want you to hear what he has to say to the Vice President. And mind you, I have my criticisms of J.D. Vance also in all of this, because the way that he answers the question, it contains kernels of truth, but being the politician, and of course he has political aspirations in the future, he's trying to fence straddle so as to not offend as many people as possible so that he can still retain their vote. That's the way that politicians operate. You have to understand that that is the way that they operate. So their answers are very measured, and they're very careful so as to say certain things so as to make sure that they keep a certain amount of the electorate. They bring in others who might not have been thinking about voting for them, and also about not losing any votes. And that's why they answer in the way that they answer. But that necessarily turns out to be a bit of a disservice. Why? Because if in the process of doing so, they have to trample upon truth, they'll do it, because ultimately their main goal is to achieve power. So you have to look at that and this interview through that lens, because although Vance's ideas or what he answers here to Rogan would necessarily seem moral, they're not. They're more from a pragmatic. They're brought forth more from a politically pragmatic point of view. So here's the first clip. I will pause it intermittently in order to comment on each individual point that's brought here.
Christian, because he thinks it's going to force people to have this in their class, and it's going to push people away from Christianity.
I mean, I understand the argument.
Okay, let me give you the background here, because at first I understand now, looking at it again, that some people will not necessarily get the context of what's happening here. And if you look at what Rogan said leading up to this interview, Rogan has highly exalted James Tallarico. We've talked about James Tallarico, whom is a Senate candidate for Texas, a guy whom he has openly been quoted as saying that even though he calls himself a Christian, he necessarily hates Christianity, but then he has to rethink certain things. All of that to say that the guy's not a true Christian. He plays the Christian, but he plays the Christian in an attempt to overturn Christian ethics by convincing Christians that the positions that he holds to, which are necessarily contradictory to Christianity, are actually in line with that which contradicts Christianity. Stated more simply, he is an infiltrator. He's a guy who he wants to make you believe that he is a Christian and actually peddling ideas that Christianity opposes as being Christian. Rogan, after he had the interview with Tallarico a few weeks ago, he says that he likes Tallarico, he likes what he's peddling, and he likes his version of Christianity. If you think I am making this up, if you think I am somehow pulling this out of thin air, research, go to X, go to Facebook, go anywhere and look at the interview, the subsequent interviews, and you'll find that what I'm saying is true. So that leads to this interview that he has with J.D. Vance just a few days ago. And he talks about how his version, Tallarico's version of Christianity, is the best in his mind. And this is what leads Rogan to say here at the very beginning that he thinks that Tallarico's idea about pushing people away from Christianity, the best way to keep people from going away from Christianity is to keep it to yourself. In other words, privatizing your faith, which has been the norm in America now for a few decades. But the fact of the matter is that that wasn't the case at the founding and for many years after the fact. When secularism became the norm in the United States, it's when that idea of privatize your religion became more popular. And it was more specifically geared toward Christians more than any others, if you look at the overall evidence. But that is the background of the context here, so you can understand what the conversation is centering over.
I just don't see it that way. I mean, I guess if
I kind
I'm
of agree with
if
them.
I hear you, but if I'm
Well, here's the thing. You can say that you can agree with Tallarico, but you have to give your basis for why. You can't simply state, as he's going to state, well, necessarily this is just a pushing of your religion. We'll get to that shortly, but just keep listening.
non-religious student and I'm sitting in there and I see the 10 Commandments, at the very least, I think I can appreciate.
Because Tallarico says that we should not be putting displays of the 10 Commandments in public. It really doesn't make any sense. I guess I'll get into it now. It really doesn't make any sense because if you put any display of the 10 Commandments in public, you have two choices. Either you can pay attention to it or simply dismiss it. But people like atheists, whom were the ones whom in the 90s and the early 2000s were pushing this idea that any public display, and I understand, for those of you that like American history, you'll say, Gio, but the movement to remove Christ from the public square had been going on for decades. Now, I get that. I completely understand that. But when I say the late 90s and early 2000s, I say it hit its stride, so-called it hit its zenith at that time. You remember, for those of you that were in high school, just like I was during that time, when they talked about the four atheistic horsemen of the apocalypse. Remember Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and this other guy, I forget his name now, that he's still around, Sam Harris, the Brit, I forget his name now, Richard Dawkins, there we go. Those were the main figureheads, as it were, of atheism that was supposedly an ascendancy in society. But guess what? When things started getting progressively bad in the country, people figured out pretty quickly that atheism didn't have an answer to these things. And they said, well, there's a void here. And we need religion, as they call it, or Christianity, to explain to us what actually is happening here, in short. But what Rogan is doing here is repeating the very same talking points that those enemies of Christ were repeating in the early 90s and telling their foot soldiers to say to Christians to get Christians to be ashamed of preaching the gospel. And unfortunately, instead of Christians noticing the trend, instead of answering forcefully, adequately to those claims of, what do you mean I'm forcing the gospel on you? I'm simply communicating a message. If you don't want to hear it, that doesn't give you the right to tell me that I have to be silent about it. If you don't want to hear it, that's your problem. But you can't tell me that I have to keep quiet about it. Otherwise, why then does that give you more of, I guess, a superior right to tell me to be quiet than it does of me to being able to communicate, and we can communicate these things forcefully back and forth to each other and even have debates about them. But notice that they use the euphemistic word push or force your religion. You're not holding a person at gunpoint when you're a believer. You're not holding a person with a knife to their throat saying, accept Christ or die. That would be literally enforcing something using force doctrine, as it were. when you're simply communicating something, a message, that's not pushing anything. You're just communicating. And if a person doesn't want to hear that, then they can simply be on their merry way. But they don't have the right, as many people will use that term, the right to shut you down. But a lot of Christians, instead of answering the way that they should, they didn't, and they began to allow space to these sorts of, again, inadequate arguments to shut down the communication of the gospel. And again, this also goes back to something I've said earlier. We're in a lot of Christians for a long time now, and it continues to plague Christianity nowadays in the West, is that they'd rather be nice, seen as nice people, instead of being faithful to Christ, and that's part of the problem here.
Appreciate it. I mean,
okay, but what if you're
I talk about this in my book. I went through sort of
what if you're a Hindu?
And so what if you are a Hindu? You're coming into a country that traditionally has a Christian background, which, to J.D. Vance's credit, he will mention. This is a Christian country. And one would expect that if you're a visitor, that you would respect the customs, the beliefs, the habits, the language, the culture of the country that you are now becoming a part of, or pretend to become a part of, and you say that you want to be a part of. No, that's not the way, that's not the doctrine that has been advanced by people like Talarico. People like Talarico, and now indirectly or directly, whichever way you want to look at it, Joe Rogan, he's actually taking the side of the pagans who come into a Christian country and now tell Christians that they have to be quiet so that they can exercise their religion, and they use, as it were, the First Amendment as a way to silence any Christian opposition to their faith, which inherently is at odds with Christianity. See, Rogan won't see it that way. Even if I have this discussion with Rogan, he's not going to see it that way because he's essentially a pluralist. But the problem is that pluralism brings its own issues, just like the very one that he's mentioning. Eventually, one is going to reach for supremacy, and the other one is going to be at the mercy of the other. Hierarchies are an inevitable part of the human experience. You're not going to eliminate that. This whole idea of absolute equality is not only a myth. People like Rogan himself, because this is where he gets on both sides of the fences, he will say, no, we can't. Why would you have men playing in women's sports? But isn't that the end result, as it were, of absolute equality, the very same thing that you're arguing on this side with respect to religion? You can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. By the way, what do I care? What do I care if a Hindu comes in here and feels offended with the Ten Commandments? This is a Christian country. We have a right, as it were. You want to use that term, or I would dare say we want to honor the very thing, the idea that helped found this country. Who are they to tell me that I can't erect something that keeps a memory to, makes space for, a memorial for the ideas, or part of the ideas, that helped found this nation? Who are they? I don't care. They shouldn't have a say. Foreigners should not have a say in how the country is administered. It's that simple. Let me use another example to prove the point here. Imagine you are opening your house to a person or people that are in need. You see them destitute, you see them in need, and you say, I'll open the door for you, I'll share my food with you, etc., etc. Welcome. All of a sudden, that person doesn't like the meal you're feeding them. They also want your wife, they want your kids, they want you to change the drapes, they want you to change the color of their house, because now they say, this is my house, and I get to dictate terms here. How would you react to that? Well, when you think about it, extend that example now to what happens in the nation. But essentially, what Rogan here is embracing and trying to kick back against what J.D. Vance is saying is, essentially, those people have, in essence, a superior position from which to demand that you not exhibit your faithfulness, your faith. That's in essence what he's saying by saying, but what about the Hindu? I don't care. If the Hindu wants to practice Hinduism, in this case, let's say the person is ethnic Indian, he can go back to India. And because that, Hinduism is very prevalent there. Go back there. Why do you want to come here and impose it on us? See, now that's an imposition when you think about it. That, when you flip it, is an actual imposition.
What if you're a Muslim and you are seeing that?
If you want, this is the thing that the liberals, they twist themselves in knots over these things because they're just not consistent. This is what happens when you have egalitarianism. It twists you in knots, and now you have contradictory viewpoints and you can't see them. If the Muslim wants to practice his Islamism, go to an Islamic country. Why do you want to come here? Why don't you go to a nation that is majority Muslim and practice there? Why do you have to go to a Christian nation and tell the Christians, no, I don't like your displays, bring it down? That's in essence what this comes down to. So in essence, Rogan is siding with the very people whom are telling Christians, I don't want your display, under the guise of public equality, that whole doctrine, and all the things that it has wrought. But at the same time, if you think about it, he's giving them the, I guess, right, the consideration that they have a right to tell Christians, I don't want to see that. This is why I keep telling people, this whole idea of absolute equality is not only a myth. A lot of conservatives, so-called, and supposedly Joe has become more conservative throughout the years, they embrace things which are not inherently conservative. This is why I don't call myself a conservative, because today's conservatives, they're more like very light liberals. I don't call myself a conservative. I call myself a biblical Christian. I'm at odds in many instances with the way that conservatives act nowadays. A couple days ago, if you followed our X feed, you'll notice that we posted a response to Megan Basham where she had criticized the announcement that the sodomite Guy Benson, whom is a Fox News contributor, now has a baby girl. And she said, this is doing such a disservice to mothers out there and to fathers as well. But the primary focus of her post was mothers, women. And I said, we posted on the X feed, stop tiptoeing around the main issue here. You have a sodomite here who is engaging in trafficking of human lives, of babies, so as to continue to try to legitimize so-called same-sex parenting. If we were a righteous country, this not only would be disallowed, it'd be punished. But that's what, her response and others, it's let me mediate my response because I don't want to get the outrage mob on me. Guess what? If you're going to stand with Christ in many instances, the outrage mob is going to come for you because you're speaking the truth. That comes with it. If that's not what you want to do, then maybe Christianity is not for you.
But not your faith.
Well,
it's a public school.
First of all, I think that I'm pretty sure Muslims, I'm not hardly an expert on Islam, but I think all of the Abrahamic faiths recognize the Ten Commandments as like a significant thing. But I think if I was a Hindu looking at the Ten Commandments, it's hard for me to say this, right, from my perspective, but I certainly went through an atheist phase in my youth. And what I would see that as a non-religious person or a different religion is I would say this is like an important cultural element of the Western civilization.
It's what I was saying earlier about J.D. Vance. In essence, there are kernels of truth in what he's saying, but necessarily notice that he's looking not to step too much on the toes of the Islamists or the Hindus or the atheists and whatnot, because ultimately he's a politician and he wants to build a coalition in order to gain power. So that's part of it. That's part of the pragmatism that these people practice. But there are kernels of truth in what he says there, and I had mentioned it earlier. So credit to him in that respect. But again, like I said earlier, in many instances, politicians, truth be damned, if it has to suffer so that I can get my power, they'll do it.
The classroom that I'm sitting in, and this idea that the law comes and is sort of above any man, even if you don't believe in God yourself. I think that's like an important concept. I mean, if you look
I want you to notice that Rogan's idea, just like Talarico's idea, they reach for the idea of, well, this is a publicly funded institution, and therefore it should either be available to all for all to express their ideas or to none at all. But here's the essential problem with that very concept in the first place. People are forced to give their tax dollars into that at gunpoint. Some will say, where is that happening? Don't pay your property taxes and see what happens. See if the state won't come after your property. There's a big discussion now in Florida happening over that very same issue. Not only over the exorbitant taxes that local counties are charging, but over the fact that, wait a minute, do I own my property outright or not? Because if I don't pay my taxes, my property tax is what ends up happening. So it's forcibly taken from the citizenry. And then those dollars are allocated in such a way where, in reality, the public really doesn't have any input as to what they're teaching. Sure, it might be influenced somewhat with respect to whatever the politicians say that they are going to do, but a lot of times the teachers' unions in this country, they're liberal, very liberal. And they are mostly in charge, and government as well is mostly in charge of putting the textbooks in the children's hands. And the textbooks themselves are produced by organizations that have a liberal bent to them. That's just the way it is. So they're not going to write these textbooks in a so-called neutral way. They're going to write them in a way where it's more indoctrination than anything else. Why do you think so many parents are pulling their kids out of public school and homeschooling them? Because they are necessarily, and mind you, this is not just Christians doing this. These are people who may be Christian adjacent but aren't necessarily Christians. And they say, I don't want my child to be indoctrinated by this stuff. I don't want them to be indoctrinated with the Islamic call to prayer as being something that it's happened. Look at, I'm pretty sure many of you social media users know that what I'm saying here, these examples I'm giving, are true. The exaltation of one thing over another. So what Joe is pointing to here is a myth. Sure, it's public money. It should be neutral. That's not the way the school system operates. That's not the way the public school system operates. It's a myth. Talarico and him are feeding you a myth. The left sees schooling, institutional schooling, as a way to program the next generation to get them to keep power so they can vote these people in power continually. Why do you think they sought control of the university so many years ago and they exerted? Charlie Kirk, for all the disagreements I had with Charlie throughout his life, that's the one thing that he saw. He said, we have to overturn this because otherwise America is in trouble if we continue to, have kids going to universities and they come out liberals, because that's the way that that's the way college is set up nowadays. And a lot of those colleges are receiving public funding, and guess what? They're inherently anti-Christian. It's the truth.
Commandments, probably 8 of them are something that I would hope that everybody would agree with, even if they're not themselves religious. So I guess here's my view on it. Like, I would not be offended if I sat in a classroom as a Christian, or if my kids sat in a classroom as a Christian and saw a religious text that wasn't Christian on the wall. I would encourage them to see that. No, I'd encourage them to see that as a learning experience, to try to understand
what if it was
things.
from the...
That's more, and what Rogan is mentioning here, he's trying to corner him. That's more one of those things where Vance recognizes that, or at least he thinks, that if that's the position that Christians are to hold, then they have to, as it were, extend that, because again, under the ideas of egalitarianism, you have to extend that consideration to others also. If I get to show what I want to show, then this person gets a chance to show. So therefore, he's mitigating the criticism, or trying to, by stating that I would show them this as that instead. But here's the essential problem with that idea. This country was founded by Christians and for Christians. This is why John Adams stated very clearly that our Constitution is for a self-ruled people. Self-ruled people meaning Christians. That's what he meant. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Once the nation becomes secular, you've got a problem, because that Constitution, which was there for a self-governing, self-ruled people, now when you have secularism, and secularism reigns supreme and tells everybody just do what thou wilt, as it were, Aleister Crowley and others, you've got a problem. No Constitution is going to withhold you. No Constitution is going to restrain you because you don't have self-rule. One of the key pillars of Christianity is you have Christ in you. You have the Holy Spirit abiding within you. So you have an inner rule, as it were, that tells you don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other thing. Do this, do that, do the other thing. Do what is good, abstain from every form of evil. But if a society doesn't think that way, it doesn't matter how many laws you put in the books. Lawlessness is going to perpetuate. That's just the way that it is. So you can see why at the beginning, when the founders create the Constitution, it was a wholly Christian country. And the people said, in essence, I know there were disagreements and whatnot over the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, all those things. Essentially what you had was, yeah, we might have some issues with this document. That's why we need the Bill of Rights, because we can see the government trampling upon people's rights if we don't amend this thing. But generally speaking, they said, well, okay, we are a self-ruled people. We're okay with this, limited government, et cetera, et cetera. That goes on a trajectory where now we lead to this place where it's gotten to the point where, as I was saying earlier, pluralism, a nation divided, a house divided, it cannot stand. Jesus himself, he stated the principle. You've got so many people pulling in so many different directions. What ends up happening? That nation, that empire, that kingdom, whatever that happens to be, that house, will not stand. It's just not going to happen. You have no homogeneity. You have no unity. You've got a problem. It's a problem. And then you've got a guy here whom Rogan is saying to him, but you wouldn't have a problem with it. I would tell Rogan outright, yeah, I would have a problem with it because we're a Christian nation. And he and I would go back and forth on that, but I would tell him the character of this nation, this is where J.D. Vance, his argument gets pretty weak, because instead of affirming this is a Christian nation and standing on that and going with that, he tries to concede a bit to the left and their egalitarian ideas, which Rogan is espousing. So you're going to fall into that trap no matter what if you give an inch on the matter. No, this is a Christian country. We should keep its Christian character. And anyone that is not Christian adjacent or is inherently opposed to that, we should kick out. It's that simple. It's that simple. That is the point to take in all of this. That way, you can't say of me, I'm pushing my religion on you. Hey, it's a Christian nation. If you don't like it, get out. It's that simple. I can't go to another nation, as it were, let's say Iran or wherever the case may be, and say, take that down, take that down, take that down, take the other thing down because it offends me personally. That's the character of that nation. Sure, I'm going to go and preach because I have to keep the commandments of my Lord and Savior, even if it costs me my life. I have to keep that command. I got to go out and preach. But when we're talking about nations here and their setups and et cetera, guys, think about it. This is essentially problematic, what Rogan is pushing here, and Vance doesn't really have a good answer for it.
What do a bunch of
I guess it depends on what it was, right? If it's,
but
if it's like something crazy, but no, I mean, if
you see,
if it's,
but so
if
even
it's,
Vance has to admit, yeah, there's like something crazy. In other words, he knows about the killing of the infidels. It's there. Can't have it both ways.
something that is like culturally interesting, I guess I don't have a problem with my kid reading
because
something.
the problem is it's mandated. Like if you have a classroom and the teacher is Christian and the teacher wants to have it in their classroom, maybe that's one thing.
But isn't that teacher necessarily then they can't express themselves? They can't express their Christianity? I've seen a lot of Islam, years ago, remember all these teachers that were adjacent to the LGBTQ and all that thing? They were peddling that and seemingly with no repercussions. But now it's a problem when Christians do it?
If you're mandating that you're going to have the 10 Commandments.
And then there are those of you who would say, Gio, but his point is not that, is that they shouldn't be pushing anything at all. So let me see, to use that phrase, that euphemism, let's see if I understood. You would rather, because everything is on an evil playing field, that have Christianity alongside sodomy and have them both competing for that, as it were, for that space, instead of saying, wait a minute, I don't think I want my kids to learn about sodomy. I'd rather them learn about not stealing, not murdering, et cetera, et cetera. Wouldn't that be better? Come on.
In classrooms. That's a different thing because now you're pushing Christianity on
there it
kids.
is again.
And this is
pushing. What is this thing about pushing? Nobody's pushing anything, Joe. Nobody's pushing anything. Is it true or not that when I was in school, when you were in school, dear listener, and they pushed evolution on us, couldn't you just stand up like I did many times, and I got raked over the coals by my classmates for it over and over again by saying evolution is false, and I had debates, arguments with the teachers over it, but they were pushing that on me, and I went to the mat with these people because I saw what they were teaching was indoctrination. It was a faulty science. It was false. But Joe doesn't have a problem with that. With teaching evolution, not a problem. It's science. Come on.
This is Tallarico's position. And as a Christian.
Guys, think about this real quick. If Tallarico's really a Christian, why is he so opposed to the dissemination of the gospel? Doesn't make any sense. This is why I continue to say Tallarico's not a Christian. Tallarico's an infiltrator trying to hijack Christianity in order to damage Christianity.
He's saying, I think this is going to push children away from Christianity.
Why? So the Bible instructs Christians that you teach a child from an early age the way that they shall go, and they will never depart from it when they are older. So you teach them the ways of righteousness. You're telling me that teaching a child in the ways of righteousness is essentially evil because it's pushing something on them? Come on. That's a downright stupid argument. That's a downright heretical argument. As a matter of fact, that is the very argument that allows people to think, yeah, maybe I should be sending off my kids to third parties that I know nothing about, but that the school says that it's licensed. God knows if they're pedophiles or not, or what they embrace. And then when they come home and they start embracing things, you ask yourself, where did you learn this? The system is screwed up. And Joe's defending that very same system under the guise of equality. Come on.
So I understand what he's saying. I think that part of living in a society where you have different people with different perspectives, but you do have, I mean, Christianity is the majority religion of the United States. It is the
Yes.
religion that
Yes.
was extraordinarily influential to our founding.
So then why, here I'm going to talk against both of them, why does Christianity have to relent? Versus in India, their main religion doesn't have to relent. In China, their main religion doesn't have to relent. In Islamic nations, their main religion doesn't have to relent. But Christianity is always the one that has to backpedal. Why?
To the constitutional principles. Again, freedom of religion is itself not really a liberal concept. It was originally derived from a Christian idea about free will and the dignity of the person. I think part of that is that you accept that you're going to have exposure to different things, and if a state legislator in a majority Christian state wants to, it's not like they're putting the Ten Commandments in front of these kids and saying, you have to read this and, write it 500 times a day. They're exposing kids to something, and I'm comfortable with kids being exposed to a lot of different things. I think that's part of living in a society.
Here's the difference between Vance and myself, because again, he embracing the whole idea of a pluralist society. I just don't think that the system itself should be so-called educating children. We've already seen the results of that. They're catastrophic. They're problematic. The parents should be the ones educating the children. Now, I know this always opens a can of worms every time I talk about this, but it's not going to get me to relent from the point that biblically, the parents are the ones who should be educating their children. So there's that. You can't argue with that. You can try to argue away all these other things and contradict what the Bible itself says. Whom are the main educators of the children? The parents. You can argue with that all you want. You can argue with me until you're blue in the face. That is just a biblical principle. So offloading that to others for the sake of convenience, which is what the public schooling system is, it's nothing more than a glorified adult, teenager, young adult learning center, nursery. That's all it is. That is in essence what he's defending here. I'm not defending that. But if you defend that paradigm, then guess what? You're caught between a rock and a hard place. Because now you have to think pluralistic society. Well, we have these pluralistic schools, and see, it's a trap.
There's a free exchange of ideas.
But even then, when I say that, I have, even then you see the inherent contradiction of all of this, because look at what's happening in states like Illinois, New Jersey, and others, where now the state is trying to do everything it can to dissuade parents from educating their own children. They are implementing measures. Just look at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association's website and look at the measures that they're trying to bring up in those legislatures, where they're in essence making it more and more impossible for parents to homeschool their children, because they want, this is the purpose. They know that schools are the indoctrination centers for the next generation of voters that will keep these liberals and others like them in power. So they like the fact that the institutions, the public institutions, are necessarily liberal because it indoctrinates the next generation to vote for that sort of thing. It's not difficult to see. It's that simple.
Alarico's sort of perspective here is again, I'm not saying that I don't want kids to be exposed to anything that is outside of the Christian canon. Like I actually want my kids exposed to things. I write about this in the book, that I think it's important to have a grounded enough faith that you can engage with a lot of different ideas and still ultimately, sort of hold on to your Christian faith.
That's a good point.
Isn't part of just living in a pluralistic democracy,
there it is again,
that people are going to be exposed to different things? And I would kind of put it on Talarico in a slightly different way, that for a long time in this country, there were actually Supreme Court rulings that said that you cannot pray in a school.
Yeah, but I would say about what Vance said there, that there were many rulings at the local, state, and even Supreme Court levels where they actually argued in favor of laws that necessarily imposed, as it were, religious restrictions at the local, state, and even federal level. That's just a fact. You look at the Northeast and many of the states when they have state religions. Yeah, you weren't going to have that federally, because you couldn't do a public test of religion for public office federally, but at the state level you had that. Massachusetts, Connecticut, look it up. They're all there. Anyways, look, I think most people, I had two clips here, but it's going to get long in the tooth here. You get my point here. You get my drift here. Whenever you hear any of these persons talking about pushing your faith, all it is a dissuasion campaign. I want you to understand that. Don't let them dissuade you from sharing the gospel or living like a Christian. Christ does not call us to privatize our faith. He calls us to externalize it. James, in his only letter in the New Testament, he says, show me your faith by your works. Very simple. You're not saved by works, but if you are saved, you will demonstrate the works. It's that simple. But here you have in this so-called secular pluralist society, secular is telling you, don't show me your faith. Ultimately, this question comes down to who you will obey, Christ or these people, whom, as I have shown on this edition, they might tell you they have good motives. They don't. They just want to squash Christianity proper. So you have to choose who you are going to obey. So ultimately, this idea of pushing your faith, especially in the society that we live in, it's a farce. Don't let anyone dissuade you or bring fear into you for that phrase. It's not the way it works. Push back, give them substantive answers, and if they don't want to listen to you, you keep preaching. You tell them, if you don't want to listen, you can move on. But I have this obligation to the Lord to communicate this message. It's that simple. All right, folks, that's all the time I have left for this edition. I invite you to the next live stream, which will be Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, same bat time, same bat channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so yet on whatever platform you're watching this, Rumble, X, YouTube. Hit that notification bell if you're watching this on Rumble or on YouTube. Click that like button, the thumbs up button on YouTube. Please help us. Algorithms, it's an algorithms game. If you enjoy the content, if there's organic interest, the algorithms will begin to share our content with others. Don't forget to share our content with others as well. Don't forget to donate. It helps us to continue to put out this content for your edification. There's a QR code in the upper left-hand corner of the screen that you can scan. Conversely, there's a link in the description box that you can follow. Last but not least, do not forget to follow us on the socials. Irrespective 77 is your username on X, TikTok, the Irrespective. That's all the time I have left for this edition. Thank you so much for watching. Until the next occasion that we gather, adieu and Godspeed.